So let's get started. I wanted to welcome you all. My name is Elizabeth Aloni, and I'm with Schneps Media. Schneps Media publishes over 70 newspapers, magazines, websites, podcasts, webinars, and events across Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Manhattan, Westchester, and Long Island. We are thrilled to moderate the Queens Borough President Candidate virtual debate brought to you by QNS.com, the Queens Courier, Time Ledger Newspapers, Ridgewood Times, El Correo, and Caribbean Life. And we thank our sponsors, QPTV and Queens County Politics. Please feel free to ask questions in our chat function and our Q&A function. We may not get to them tonight, but we will reach out to the candidates and get answers to those questions and publish it on QNS.com and our other media outlets after the debate. I'm now going to turn it over to your moderators. Have a wonderful time.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Kaye. I'm the digital editor with QNS.com. To start off, I'd just like to thank City Council Member Donovan Richards, City Council Member Costa Constantinides, former City Councilwoman Elizabeth Crowley, Anthony Miranda, and Dao Yin for joining us tonight. Turn it over to Angélica Acevedo, a reporter with QNS.com.
Hi, everyone. I'm Angélica Acevedo. I am a reporter with QNS, reporting mostly on Western Queens. And I'll let Karmina introduce herself.
Hi, thank you. Good night, everybody. My name is Karmina Lima, and I'm the editor-in-chief for El Correo, which is our Spanish publication. So very happy to have everybody here.
All right. Sorry, you can go ahead.
So to kick it off, let's start with each candidate giving a 1-minute opening statement. Let's start with Councilman Costa, then Councilman Donovan Richards, then Anthony, Elizabeth, and then Dao.
All right. Let me know when I can start. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Angélica, and everyone at QNS for putting this together this evening. My name is Costa Constantinides. I'm running to be your next borough president. Right now, Queens has been going through some tough times, and we've been the epicenter of the COVID crisis. And this administration on all levels has failed us. We've seen real estate developers drive the conversation in our borough for too long, and the impacts that have been losing of hospitals. We need a plan to rebuild our healthcare system here in the borough of Queens, to fight environmental racism in communities of color, and fight for environmental justice. We need a plan for better transit, and to improve our schools in the long term, and to fight for truly affordable housing that's free of real estate developers. We have a plan to do that, and my name, as my name that says before, Costa Constantinides, we hope that you'll be having this conversation tonight, and that you can go to votecosta.com for more information. Thank you.
Ready to go?
Yep, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here. And first, I want to thank QNS for holding this debate. I think this is our second one, but this one virtually. And, we've gone through a lot of challenging times. This county, this country, this city is at a pivotal time where we're going to need some leadership to bring coalitions together. I'm happy to have the endorsement of former Borough President Claire Schulman because of my track record and really addressing and being able to withstand crises. There's been no community hit harder in terms of deaths when it comes to COVID. I lost over 1,000 constituents to COVID. And really the large part of that really has to do with the disparities that we've historically seen in certain pockets of our city and certainly certain pockets of our borough. I represent the Rockaways, a place that was devastated after Hurricane Sandy, during Sandy. And on day one, I am ready to rebuild this borough, just as I did the economy of the Rockaways, bringing in close to 10,000 units of affordable housing, 300,000 square feet of new retail slated, hammers in the ground as we speak, 400 jobs on the Thriftway site. We've also shepherded in Bartlett Dairy, 400 union jobs right outside the outskirts of JFK Airport. And also $2.2 billion in infrastructure money, which is going to go to address the systematic issues when it comes to infrastructure or the lack thereof it across this borough. Over 55 projects slated for this borough based on the work I did when I was Environmental Protection Chair. A new library, a new precinct. The 116th precinct will be the first additional precinct we add in Queens. And it's going to be very important that we bridge these gaps between police and community as we move forward by also holding the police department accountable and looking at their expense budget as we move forward to make sure that we address the issues of food insecurity and housing and all of the other challenges that we're going to see moving forward. So I look forward to the debate tonight, and I'm ready to lead this borough on day one. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Hi, my name is Anthony Miranda. I'm your candidate for Queensborough President. The Queensborough President is going to play a crucial role over the next 4 years about the changes that are made here in Queens. Changes that we have been asking for as families here in Queens for far too long. Politicians have not serviced us. Politicians have failed to get the changes that we've been asking for all along. From the response to COVID-19, to unemployment, to small businesses closing in record numbers, to affordable housing, to the changes that we've asked for in the New York City Police Department and reform and accountability. For far too long, we've been asking and not receiving the changes that we need. I have over 30 years advocating for the people of our community, to those people who have been silenced for far too long. And now's the opportunity to create the changes that have been absolutely necessary for a long time. I'm asking for your support for Queensborough President because I have my family, like you have your families raised here in Queens, and we waited too long for the changes and the support that we needed for our children and for our life here. So I ask you to make sure you hold everyone accountable on this call to the messages they give you, and do some fact checking about the information that they provide. Then hold them accountable when this debate is over. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Good evening. I want to thank Schneps Media and QNS.com for hosting this online debate tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak directly with Queens voters about how important this upcoming election is. So many in our communities are hurting right now, and they're looking for strong, steady leadership. And when you look at our borough and the generations of lack of investment in our infrastructure, it's no coincidence that we were the center hardest hit by the COVID crisis. And COVID has made our problems even worse. When you look at our social, economic, racial injustices that are happening in our communities throughout the borough, it literally made matters much, much worse. And we need a leader that knows how to fight for every community's fair share. Frankly, I've been fighting for fair share ever since I can remember. I was born the 14th of 15 children. I know what it's like to work in, to be raised in a family by a single mom, and me, myself, I raised my 2 sons as a single mom. I know the struggles that so many of our families are facing right now. And I have experience leading in crisis time. Going back to September 11th, I left my union job to help small businesses get back on their feet and thousands of New Yorkers regain employment. I was elected in 2008 after the last fiscal crisis. And I fought City Hall time and time again to protect education and public service and public safety and stick up for my community and get its fair share. So I look forward to the discussion tonight, and I hope I can find the voters' trust here in the upcoming election.
And finally, Mr. Yin.
Good evening. My name is Dao Yin. I'm the only candidate focusing on public safety. What happened in Minnesota was a crime and unjustified. We all agree. While we are all appalled by the looting and crime that has occurred recently across our city. The city saw 13 murders the first week of June and 40 reported shootings. These levels of violence are twice as high from this time last year. 300 NYPD officers have been injured in recent protests. I'm the only candidate truly supporting our men and women in blue. We must keep our residents safe. Recent events further demonstrate the importance of voting and real change. I'm also the only candidate on this stage who stood up for the right of everyone to vote. Because of the inaction of my 4 opponents, hundreds of thousands of registered Queens voters are now unable to vote in this election on June 23rd. I'm the only candidate who will bring people together and rebuild the people's trust. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your opening statements. We'll get into the first question. You'll have 2 minutes to respond. And we will go in the opposite order in which we introduced ourselves, if that's all right. So the first question, actually, Mr. Yin just alluded to it. Obviously, the most pressing issue, or at least the most relevant issue in the news today, concerns the protests over the police killing of George Floyd and the continuation of police violence against Black Americans. So within your scope of powers as Queens Borough President, what, if anything, would you do to address the issues raised by the recent protests? Mr. Yin, we'll start with you.
We all know that the police have been politicized for their handling of the protests. Let's talk about the protests. I'm in favor of peaceful protests, as I did for years. However, many of the protests have provoked the police. People have screaming, hollered, all sorts of insults at the police, and even have attacked the police physically for hours on end. How would you react if someone did this to you? The police have tremendous self-control. The police did a very good job overall in handling the protesters. I know many of you running for Queens Borough President cannot hold up under screening from your constituents in the town hall meeting without losing your cool. The police have far more self-control than you do. Thank you.
Think I'm up next?
Yep.
Well, first, I'm outraged by the killing of George Floyd. George Floyd's life mattered. Black lives matter. Law enforcement in New York City and across the country has, for generations, institutional racism, and it has plagued law enforcement. And we need to do better as a society to train our officers in de-escalation when they're out there at these protests that should be peaceful. I do also agree that protests are important, but that they should remain peaceful. I don't agree with the protests that have gotten out of control, turned into riots and looting. And I don't agree with abuse to our law enforcement, such as we've seen with bricks and Molotov cocktails. But I also don't agree with police brutality. And we have no room for it whatsoever, no tolerance. We have to do more to rid our department from any brutality. And that comes with training. I believe that the majority of our police department, the officers that go to work, it's a job, they work every day. They took an oath to protect and serve. I do believe that they're good and want to do good. And we need to make sure that we're attracting the best that reflect the diversity of our communities. And that's why I support a new class of police cadets, because every time we get a new class, we have a more diverse department. In addition to that, we have a better training academy than ever before, but of course that needs to be improved upon. But we have an opportunity to take a new class and train them in the best case scenario of policing, which needs to happen. And in addition, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. Every year it gets worse and worse. We don't have the budget to spend so much on overtime. And that happens to do with the lack of size of force. And when you have newcomers coming in, they get paid less. So I think it's important to not defund the police department, as we've been hearing. And even Bernie Sanders agrees with that. And every candidate that's running for president doesn't believe that we should defund. But we should look at every city agency needs to make cuts to wasteful spending, and there is wasteful spending in the police department. So I do agree with cuts, but not defunding. I think that's a little extreme.
All right, that's time.
Mr. Miranda?
Okay, so we talked about the protests and the need to support the protests. We absolutely support the protests that are going on, not only here in New York, but across the country. Police reform and accountability has been a struggle that we've been involved in for over 30 years, advocating for the changes right here in New York City and across the United States. Changes in police culture, changes in police policy. There's an opportunity right now, because we have such an awakening of the people, to create the changes that we've been long advocating for. We should not have to wait for the death of another person of color before we get another movement to say that changes are necessary. Police reform is necessary. Police accountability, absolutely. And I have recommended several changes. A permanent special prosecutor above the police commissioner and above the district attorney's office, someone who has that power and authority to conduct those investigations and hold officers accountable. Removing the police trial room back to the Office of Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. The only agency to have its own trial room is the New York City Police Department. We shouldn't have that. Then all these disciplinary cases would be open and discoverable to the public. Changing 50A was one step, but let us not believe that that is the changes that addresses police brutality and accountability, because that is not. Don't allow politicians to take us in a direction that we don't need to be when we're at the crux of a great opportunity for real police change. 50A is good. They should have never had the protections to begin with. And the majority of police officers don't have disciplinary records that need to be discovered. But for those that do, they should be disclosed, because if the police department has a history of moving problem officers from one precinct or one community to another community, and the community is not aware of the circumstances by which that officer arrived. So I think it's extremely important to have full disclosure, not only about the transfers and the placement of personnel, but about their personnel history as well. I think it's a fact.
Right. That's time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilman Richards?
Thank you. And, you know, for African Americans such as myself, it's been a really difficult time. And this time has really opened up, you know, everybody's wounds, you know, reopened them. I was 13 years old when I first got stopped and frisked. I also subsequently had guns drawn on me during that stop and frisk. And by God's grace, I was blessed to actually live through that experience and to live another day. You know, this is not the first time we've been here. I mean, I attended Eric Garner's trial every day. I saw his autopsy photos. When you saw George Floyd's situation arise again, I mean, if you were human, it certainly hit a sore point for you. And this is what's ignited people out on the streets every day, marching every single day. And let me just say, in Queens, we have had none of those issues because of the relationship building with our local precincts, although we do have issues with the system as a whole. I also just want to point out that we condemn the actions of those who, in the jest of the protest, are out there looting and throwing Molotov cocktails. That is not what this movement is about. It's about ensuring we can move forward. And this is why I'm proud to be bringing a new precinct to the borough that will also incorporate a food pantry and also community center space. I mean, as we talk about merging the relationship between a police department and our communities, one way to do that is to ensure that we can coexist and learn one another and learn about each other as we move forward. We're not here to condemn an entire department, but we do want to condemn the actions of those who are also costing the city $237 million a year in settlement claims, right? When you think about overtime, $780 million in overtime spent last year in the NYPD, and during the pandemic, the NYPD certainly will not need as much overtime because there are a lot of events that have been postponed. So there's been a lot of conversation around defund, and that word has sort of got tricky, but it's really about reimagining the police department and what policing looks like specifically in the 21st century. And that's why the repeal of 58 was so important. On next week, I will pass 7 bills that will reform the police department, including my own bill, which creates a discipline matrix for the first time in New York City, which mandates the police commissioner to come up with a standard and punishment of discipline for those who are not upholding CPR. That's what communities are asking for. We're asking for courtesy, professionalism, and respect, and we're asking for everyone to be treated exactly the same way, no matter what the color of our skin is, no matter what our religion is, no matter what part of the borough we live in. And one thing we can do as borough president is watch that data very carefully. 50A is going to certainly show some bad apples, and we want to make sure we're cleaning house in Queens. The communities deserve to know who is policing them. So we have a lot of work to do. We also hold roundtables lastly with all the precinct commanders a month. Thank you. Thank you.
Lastly, Councilman Constantinides. Sorry, Councilman, you're on mute.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. We have to talk about Black Lives Matter and the outrage around not just the death of George Floyd, but the institutional racism that's been systemic in this system for generations. This is also a common, when we talk about the police department, we're talking about a conversation around race and poverty. We've been throwing, anytime there's an issue, whether it's in our schools, we'll bring the NYPD into the schools. There's issues around turnstile jumping or issues in the subways, bringing more police into the subways. They've been there, we've been using the police as Band-Aids, when instead we should be de-escalating situations. We need to reimagine not just policing, but how our city works and who should be doing what. There should not be police at traffic stops, traffic infractions. We should be looking at ways, like you talk about street vendors and not having them do that enforcement anymore. Ways of putting professionals in place that can de-escalate situations. We shouldn't have the militarization of our police force that oppress our minority communities. We need to do better. When you talk about defunding, it's about making sure we're not militarizing our police force, that we're not going to keep throwing more money into new cadets. And in this budget, that we're going to invest in things like summer youth programming, that we're going to invest in the people in our communities that for too long have not seen the investment they deserve. And as borough president, and that was the question, what we can do as borough president, it's not just about this budget, it's about every budget that's going to be subsequent as borough president, that to make sure we're upholding those ideals of fighting to make sure that we are looking at this holistically and that we're making sure our budgets reflect our priorities and that we're evaluating in the long term, not just policing, but how our policies work. Because this is, we've seen the failed curfews policies and the attacks on the protesters as well. And of course, we condemn the looting that went on. But there should be a space for free speech, and we need that free speech to make sure we can fight for a better borough and a better city. Thank you.
Thank you. It's time. All right, on to the next question, Karmina.
Yes, hi everybody again. Well, prior to the killing of George Floyd and the protests that follow, the COVID-19 crisis was at the forefront of everyone's mind. So at its peak, COVID-19 was killing nearly 200 people per day in Queens, disproportionately affecting Black and Latino Americans. Lives have been lost, sources of income have vanished, and business standing for decades might never open again. As Borough President, what is your plan for the COVID-19 recovery? I would like to start with ladies, if gentlemen don't mind. Councilwoman Crowley?
Okay, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sure. That's a very important question. And in my opening statement, I talked a little bit about fair share and how we were the epidemic center of that pandemic. And that we've had generations of lack of investment in our infrastructure. When you look at healthcare infrastructure, Queens has the fewest hospital beds out of all the boroughs when you look at that per capita, our population. And when you need an emergency response from an ambulance, you know, our paramedics and EMTs are working very hard, but they were working very hard before COVID. And we have the highest response times in the city. Your odds of surviving, whether it's COVID, a car crash, a shooting, cardiac arrest, are much less here in Queens. And that's not fair. You know, our healthcare should not be determined on your zip code. And it's not just one area of Queens versus another. The vast majority of our borough is underserved. Why did we get COVID and why did it spread so quickly? That infrastructure extends beyond the boundaries of our healthcare. Our transit, the 7 train, it is the most overcrowded train in the city. And if it's not the 7 train on a certain day, then it's the E train. And when you have people packed in and trains moving into stations without even room, and you have a contagious disease, you have spreading that happens there. And furthermore, when you look at our housing situation, so many of our families are doubling up just to put a roof over their head because the cost of housing is not obtainable. And you saw families, I saw it, I spoke to many families that had COVID and they didn't have enough space in their house to be separate from loved ones, and there you had rapid spreading happening. So we need to put a plan together to attract more private hospitals and to expand our public hospitals, to look at our existing hospitals and to expand their bed capacity, and certainly bring more emergency services so we do not have the highest response time. That's something I've worked on for years, and each year when I was in the council, I was able to expand EMS services. But each year,
Sorry, that's time.
Our population kept getting larger. So there's a lot of work ahead of us to work together to do. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you. Mr. Miranda?
Well, I thank you for that question. So we're talking about COVID-19 and the response that we received. And I think everybody in our community can attest to the fact that Queens was probably one of the areas most underserviced right now. Not only during the pandemic, but after the pandemic. And different areas in Queens got different amount of service as well. I think that was a failure on the part of many of our elected officials not to be at that table. It's one thing when after something happens, we speak about the discriminatory impact something has had, but it's something different that knowing that our community was in need of services, to be able to have a seat at that table and force those conversations to ensure that there was equity and distribution to that response here in Queens is extremely important. As the Queensborough president, I'll make sure that I'm at those tables, not only for past conversations and investigations that have to happen, but for the next COVID-19 spread that happens or the next pandemic that we face. We can't afford to wait till after something happens to have real conversations about the impact on our communities. As far as in boosting the economy now after this, there's been a bill in the City Council, the Small Business Survival Act, and that's been there for many years, but they failed to pass it. It will give relief to the small business owners and give some comfort so they can be able to give the jobs to local residents and improve the local economy. We're giving more protections to big businesses and more handouts to industrial institutions that want to come in here to Queens, but we're not supporting the small business owners. So when you speak to them, they're in a crucial point that many of them won't open again. But a good place to start would have been passing the Small Business Survival Act and ensuring that there are programs like the buybacks that are given. Remember, there are a lot of buyouts and givebacks to the community, but when you looked at how many actually reached Queens, then you say we have failed. Queens did not get its proportion of relief to small business owners to be able to survive. And that would have been the responsibility of elected officials, elected representatives of Queens, to ensure that the distribution was fairly done and there was equity, but that was not the picture that we face right now. The pandemic exposed systemic discriminations, problems in a system that didn't just occur today or during the pandemic, but it exposed all the discrepancies that are built into a system that has failed people of color traditionally and poorer communities. We need to have that representation up front, and we need to have a borough president that's going to have to fight to represent us.
Thank you very much. Councilman Constantinides?
Thank you for that question. And Queens was the epicenter of the COVID crisis. And as someone who contracted COVID-19, and both myself and my wife, and being in the emergency room during the height of the pandemic, and seeing hundreds of people gasping for air, it's an image that's never going to leave who I am. I remember being back in 2009, fighting against the closure of Mary Immaculate Hospital, begging, but at the time the state decided that it would rather, it wasn't fiscally responsible to keep a hospital in Southeast Queens open. And we saw 5 hospitals in Queens closed in 20 years. And I wasn't a council member at the time. I was someone who was fighting in the community who knew that Queens needed help. As a council member, we've been working hard to bring resources into our district. Mount Sinai, Queens, worked with the Queens delegation to bring them the resources, including a new stroke center. So no one, as someone who lost their father to a brain injury, we need to have more resources in Queens. We need to make sure that we're building new hospitals. We need to make sure we're imagining hospital space. We need to be working with both the private, like we did here in Queens and saw the expansion of Mount Sinai, Queens, and their vision here. We get more private hospitals, more expansion, support our public hospitals, and there's going to be a sad reality. Many of the men and women who are still sick in Queens, who are still on ventilators, are going to be on ventilators for a long time. How do we build that into our system? What happens if there's a second wave? There needs to be a long-term plan for the healthcare of Queens to answer these questions. It can't be building temporary structures. We need to be building long-term structures that are going to be with us in Queens for the long term to serve all of our residents, and not something that's going to be a pop-up during a crisis that we're going to pull up stakes and they're going to vanish. It has to be better than that. It has to be a long-term plan. And as borough president, it's my job to use our capital budget. It's our job to fight back against real estate developers, to have hospitals in our neighborhoods. It's my job to fight for more hospitals in our neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jin?
As the only Asian American in this race, the coronavirus pandemic is personal to me. The pandemic has brought to light an underlying hatred of Asians in this country. And I'm very disturbed by the overall increase in racism. Queens, despite its unique diversity, is no exception. Our public health system is terrible because politicians have taken large donations from the healthcare industry. My opponents have been in politics for years, and we know they have received contributions from all types of special interests. That's why our public health infrastructure is falling apart. Queens' public health infrastructure is incapable of addressing the needs of our residents in normal times, let alone during this pandemic. Let there be no mistake. Compared to other boroughs, Queens has been left behind. New York City has allocated $8 to $9 billion for new jails. This money could be used for public health and as priorities instead. It's the time for new leadership. Also, it's an outrage that the police were on duty for coronavirus enforcement, but were not given masks to protect themselves. I have.
Sorry, that's time.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Richards?
Well, thank you for that question. And let me just start with that. This city is facing immense challenges. We are in close to a $9 billion deficit. And boy, would it have been good to have Amazon right now in Queens and be able to count on some of that revenue that we certainly could have used to address a lot of these issues now. You know, one thing that's important to know is that tomorrow's not promised, right? And now we're in this deficit. And we could have used that. But let me just start off with some things we can do. You know, we should be expanding opportunities, and we're going to have to work very closely with the governor when it comes to expanding hospitals. You know, the governor rolled out a Brooklyn plan, which encompasses ensuring that he strengthens the economy of Brooklyn, right? I mean, so some of that money is going to go to healthcare, to expanding those initiatives there. But how about Queens? We're going to have to really work with him through this period. I'm happy to have the endorsements of both 1199, and I recently just been endorsed by the New York State nurses based on the work we have done to expand hospital capacity in the Rockaways. For instance, we expanded St. John's ER room. We also put money in with the former borough president, Melinda Katz, to expand the maternity ward at St. John's Hospital. I work with Melinda Katz on expanding now the Adabo Health Center in the Rockaways. And we lost Peninsula Hospital because the governor closed it in 2012. But one of the opportunities we have now with the new development, and it's going to be important that we leverage land use opportunities as it moves across the borough to Sunnyside, to Jamaica, to the Rockaways. We're going to have to leverage that opportunity to push developers to also think about healthcare. And one of the things I'm happy about is health and hospitals has shown some interest in coming to the Rockaways. So perhaps we could have some public hospital footing as we wait on federal dollars to come down as well. In terms of our small businesses, I have a bill in the council, a transparency bill. You should know that the city offered loans and grants. Only 9% of those that funding came to Queens, 56% to Queens. I will have the Small Business Services Commissioner out in Queens on tomorrow because, you know, we have to talk about why Queens didn't get its fair share. Food insecurity, housing vouchers, foreclosure assistance. Those are things we're going to have to focus on. There are a myriad of issues, but once again, the budget is critical. We're going to have to ensure that we're not prioritizing a new police class and the NYPD is cutting 1% of the budget, but that we're prioritizing the needs of communities.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We'll have the next question, Angélica.
Thank you so much. Councilman Richards, you kind of alluded to it with your answer. And speaking of recovery in the future, there are a number of large developments coming to Queens from the Long Island City waterfront to the LaGuardia Air Train and many more. What is your stance on the direction of development in the borough? So let's start with Mr. Miranda. Anthony, we can start with you. Can you hear?
Mr. Miranda, can you hear us?
Can you hear us, Mr. Miranda? I don't know if we can. So let's start with Mr. Yin.
Thank you. Let's talk about housing as the one of the most important development. Because of our failed political establishment, the city's housing crisis is hitting Queens disproportionately hard. We need to eliminate all tax credits to luxury housing now. All of those tax credits should go to low and middle income housing. I'm also the only candidate on this stage to champion reasonably priced prefabricated buildings that will ensure real estate developers can make a profit while charging reasonable rent prices. Because too many of the new housing projects service the upper class and the super rich. Given that I have to be a business manager in China, Japan, and the United States, I know the best tactics and strategies to keep costs in check and ensure we are focusing on right housing projects. I'm the only candidate to advocate for 10% rent tax credit for middle-class families who are struggling with increasing housing costs. Also, speaking of the transit, the residents of Queens have the longest commute in the entire city, and they bear the brunt of crumbling transit system. To solve this issue, we should increase the frequency of express buses from Queens to the city. Light rail should be built throughout Queens.
It's time,
Queens.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Mr. Miranda is back. So if you're ready.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something happened there, so I'm not sure what the question. I couldn't hear anything you guys were saying at that point.
Okay, so I can repeat it. So speaking of recovery and the future of Queens, there are a number of large developments happening or coming from the Long Island City waterfront to LaGuardia AirTrain and Flushing. So what is your stance on development and the direction of it in the borough?
Okay. First of all, I've been saying this for a while. I believe that we need to have a moratorium on all luxury development right now. We need to freeze those projects until they've had the
Sorry, Mr. Miranda, you've been muted again.
All right, how about now?
Yep.
Okay,
Also, just a reminder for everyone else to mute yourselves while other people are speaking. Thank you.
again, so the moratorium on luxury development is extremely important. And then there are a number of projects that have been pushed forward that had little to no community input. So we need to go back and make sure that the community is being heard where they're making these developments at anyway. And I believe there's a greater need than luxury development in the borough of Queens. Affordable housing. Again, let's get those things done. Let's provide housing for the homeless. Those are the projects that we need. We need new schools. We don't have sufficient space for schools for our children right now. Why are we investing and taking the chance on luxury development in the borough of Queens when we haven't fixed the problems that we've been facing for far too long? Many of the families here in Queens have all expressed protests. They've had protests out in front of these projects because they've been either been disregarded or their voices haven't been heard and they haven't been communicated to properly. So before we approve any of these luxury developments, I think we need to know what the communities are in need of right now and how we can fill the needs of our communities as they exist today. But again, that's what you have when you have elected as politicians who are accepting money from luxury developers, right? So they approve these projects with little or no community input. So check and see how many elected officials have received money from these billionaire developers. And they're the ones who are approving these projects, but they stay silent later on. But every one of the elected officials here at one point had received that money, but they may say today they have not, but they have. And so when you're catering to the money that's being given to you, then you tend to disregard the voice of the community residents who are the ones in the most need right now. So again, a moratorium on luxury development until a feasibility study has been done as the strain on the infrastructure on the entire system right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go ahead with Crowley. Unmute yourself. You're on mute.
Sorry. With the onset of me getting involved in the campaign and deciding to run for Queens Borough President, I made a conscious decision not to take from for-profit real estate development. I believe that land use decisions have recently let these developers overdevelop in too many areas and not build enough affordable housing. And that's why we need a master planner in the Borough President's office. Part of my master plan for Queens is not only developing housing in the proper areas, but also making sure that we have a better transit system. And that means keeping our express buses in place, making the other buses, which are currently free, keeping them free, and taking our existing rail that is being underutilized or is cost prohibitive to too many, and opening access to over 20 square miles of rail where we could look at opportunities to build properly. Our schools are severely overcrowded. And when I took office, we had the most overcrowded school district that I represented. I'm proud that during the time that I served, we built out over 6,000 new classroom seats. And when I left the city council, my school district was no longer overcrowded. But when we look at Queens, 5 of our 7 community education council districts are in bad shape when it comes to our overcrowding. And our schools are underfunded. So we need a leader that's going to fight for Queens' fair share and have a proper plan for development.
Thank you. Let's go ahead with Councilman Richards.
Thank you. And I think I'm the only council member in New York City that actually had a community board that actually supported a rezoning, and partly because we did actual community-based planning where we had the city come out and engage residents from the Jewish community to our public housing residents, to our clergy members, to the community board, and we had this broad coalition to our small businesses. And when you look at downtown Far Rockaway, I mean, it's just the template for what you need to do to accomplish development, successful development around the borough. I had a place that was blighted for 40 years when I came into office. Every elected official who came before me tried to fix it. And we were able to actually work with a developer who didn't want to do anything with it. All it did was create a recipe for unemployment, for crime. And it was the first thing you saw when you got off the A train, quite frankly. I'm happy today to say that as you come into the Rockaways now, you'll see nearly 1,700 units of housing being built, a $40 million library. For those who know what Far Rockaway Library looked like before, they didn't even have books in the library. It had systematic issues rooted in it that actually prevented our children from actually getting the education they need. Then we talk about infrastructure. When it rained, the mothers had to push their kids in the street because the sidewalks would have puddles on them. We put together over $100 million in infrastructure money there. Then you look at a place that was sorely undeveloped and under retail, so you couldn't even create jobs. I'm happy today to say on the site, we have 400 people working as we speak, but we're developing also over 100,000 square feet of new retail. We also inked in and work with local organizations and CBOs to track the job retention. So organizations like Urban Upbound and also RDRC are tracking the agreement we reached with the developer to create 30% local hiring deal as well. So it's going to take somebody who has an expertise. I'm the former chairman of the zoning committee. I know how to put these pieces together. I rezoned from East New York to East Midtown to Far Rockaway. And we, once again, were the only community board in New York City that approved the rezoning. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And finally, Councilman Costa Constantinides.
So looking at a post-COVID world, it's like, who got richer during this pandemic? Well, the answer to that is billionaires. The rich only got richer while hardworking New Yorkers, hardworking Queens residents suffered. So to say that the answer to the question that we're looking for in our recovery is to facilitate more billionaires getting richer is not the way I think we should need to go. That's why I'm proud to be in, we need to think about the real residents of Queens, the 2.3 million residents of Queens who are hardworking, who want better jobs, who want real jobs, not race to the bottom, but jobs with benefits. That's why I'm proud to be endorsed by the Teamsters and RWDSU and Local 1500 who stood up to Amazon to say, we're not gonna have a race to the bottom here in our borough. But we need jobs that are real, jobs that are going to provide real pathways to a future. So I can buy a home, so I can put my kids through school, so I can retire with dignity. That's the model that we have to have here in the borough of Queens. We look at public land, it has to be for public use. We can't just be giving away land to real estate developers, hoping through their philanthropy that we're going to just get some sort of benefit. We have to drive hard bargains. So it has to be about real affordable housing. It has to be about creating real jobs that have benefits in the borough of Queens. It has to be about creating an economy. That's why I've committed to creating 50,000 green jobs here in the borough of Queens, working on things like transforming Rikers Island to a renewable energy island, solarizing and green roofing every city building in the borough of Queens, making sure we're investing in renewable energy, making our borough the leader when it comes to new 21st century jobs. Those are union jobs. That's what we need to do. That's how we build an economy here in Queens that's for everyone, not just for the rich.
Thank you.
All right. So for the sake of time, we're going to move on to the closing statements. If you could just sum up why we should vote for you. We'll start with Mr. Miranda.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you so much. So I'm running for Queensborough president because we need accountability and we need the changes that our families have desperately needed for so long. The changes, police tactics, police accountability, have 30 years fighting that fight to create the changes that we've been looking for. These elected officials have had 6 years, 8 years or more to create the changes that our communities have desperately needed and have failed us. There's been no introduction of legislation to deal with illegal police quotas for summonses and arrests in our community. That's a fact. That's why I say check the information when they make these statements in front of you and hold them accountable. Because they've had the opportunity to create the changes that are desperately needed to help us in our schools and our housing, to help the homeless population, to do the things that were required for our families. And they just failed to do it. They'll get up here and tell you they did all kinds of things, but let's look at the facts when you check them, and you'll find out that there's reality, because many of you live here like I do, and you know that the things they're speaking to have never happened for our families. So if you've been suffering like I've been suffering, if your schools have been overcrowded like the schools have been overcrowded for my son, when you know that your neighbors have been suffering, then you too understand that they have failed us. The next Queensborough president is going to be your voice and your advocate. None of them have the experience of over 30 years fighting for the community and being successful at it. I'm asking for your vote because we can no longer afford to wait for politicians to decide when it'd be convenient for them to make the changes that we need. I'm not controlled by machine politics. I'm controlled by the people. And I'll be controlled by your voices, and I'll be representing you over all their interests.
It's time.
Please, again, I implore you, voting makes a difference. Your vote will decide who will be the next Queensborough president. We need to make change, and it needs to happen now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Yin.
I'm the only candidate left in this race who is championing a public safety message. I will work to listen to everybody and unite leaders across Queens to keep our citizens safe and fight against all forms of racism. Small businesses are our lifeblood. As an Asian American and a businessman, I also know the struggles that small business owners face, especially given the ongoing health crisis. Because of the inaction of my opponents on this stage, we will not have an elected leaders in Queens all year. All registered voters will not be able to vote for the next Queensborough president on June 23rd. I will bring creative leadership to Queens and ensure that we bring our economy back on track. Again, my name is Dao Yin. I hope to earn your vote and become the first Asian American Queensborough president. Thank you.
Ms. Crowley. Sorry, you're still on mute.
There we go. Thank you. I want to thank our organizers for putting tonight's debate together, and my colleagues, I wish them well. We're facing a very difficult time in Queens, and we need strong leadership now more than ever. And that is strong, steady leadership with the experience to lead in crisis times. I go back to September 11th, leaving my union job to work with small businesses, to work to get employees back to work, creating jobs and opportunity, and then taking office during the worst fiscal crisis that we faced after the financial crisis, which was the worst since the Great Depression. But now we're looking at a much worse crisis. Somebody who has experienced leading in difficult times. When the mayor back then wanted to close firehouses, I fought every year, and we saved those firehouses in our community. When the speaker did not want to give equal funding to every single council district, I fought for fair share. And now it is policy that every district in the city gets its fair share. You name it, when it comes to Queens, we don't get our fair share. Funding in our borough president's office, we don't get our fair share per capita. Our kids are in classrooms that are overcrowded and underfunded, the tune of nearly $2,000 per student compared to Brooklyn or the Bronx. Sorry, I'll wrap up. Experience to lead in crisis time also happened after Superstorm Sandy, when I ran a very large volunteer effort. We need a borough president that's ready to work day one, that's ready to take Queens forward, to expand our transit, to build housing, and most importantly, grow our jobs and opportunity. And with your support, I hope to work together to make sure that we also change our community boards to make sure they reflect the diversity of the community. And that's a very important role that our borough president makes. Know that this I'm running, just lastly, is a grassroots effort. And we've got the most union support, endorsed by the transit workers, communication workers, our first responders, and many, many more, because they know that I have a plan to move Queens forward. Thank you.
And Councilman Richards.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for hosting this forum. And it's truly been an honor. And I want to thank all of the candidates who are running. We've all sacrificed a great deal from our families and a lot of time. Just want to say that, you know, in particular, there's no one in this race who's actually managed a crisis. You know, you look at the economy we've rebuilt in a post-Sandy world, how we've been able to make sure green energy and good jobs and infrastructure and housing and education funding and new parks, and everybody knows Rockaway Beach, 10 million visitors last year. There's no one in this race who has had to rebuild a community from ground up like I have. I've had, over the course of the last 6 years in the council, have gained a great expertise chairing 3 key committees: the Environmental Protection Committee, the Zoning Committee, and Public Safety, all things very important to the borough of Queens and in its residents. I'm running because I, you know, want my son to grow up in the Queens free of fear. I don't want my son to have that fear I do when a police car is behind him. I want my son to grow up in a Queens where the economy works for all of us, where we have one standard for education. I want my son to grow up and celebrate the diversity in this borough, not tear it down like former resident Trump, which we're reneging his passport from this borough for. I want a transportation system that works for each and every one of us, where we don't have to travel 2 hours to get to Manhattan to a low-wage job, and where that inequity certainly has shown itself is during COVID-19. We want a Queens that works for everyone. While there are some people who say they have the most unions, I have the largest municipal unions supporting me in this race, from the UFT, our teachers, to 1199 and the New York State Nurses Association, to 32BJ, our airport workers. The list goes on, and we want to continue to build a Queens that works for each and every one. DC 37 workers, you know, the working people of Queens. And we want to ensure that our low-wage workers, our poor families, have a key opportunity to climb that ladder here. Queens has always been a place of opportunity. My dad just became a citizen last year. You know, I want to make sure we're creating that pathway for Queens residents to find citizenship. This is why Catalina Cruz has endorsed me. We have a plan to ensure that we create immigrant welcome centers here in Queens County. We need to build a Queens for all. This is our time. We cannot squander this moment. Even through crises, we must find opportunities. And I'm ready on day one to drive this borough across the finish line, to be its cheerleader and defender. And we're ready to do that at day one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilman Constantinides.
I want to thank QNS and everyone tonight, and my fellow colleagues. I mean, we're down the last 12 days. I wish you all well, and I hope that you all continue to stay safe and healthy. The quintessential question that we need to answer is, what Queens do we want to build for the future? And how is the borough president going to play a pivotal role in that future? The borough president has three main jobs. It has a land use power, advisory of a land use, which is fighting, standing up to real estate developers, and making sure we get truly affordable housing and that public land is for public use. It's about making sure that we use the power of the budget, that capital budget that we have every year, to invest in our schools, invest in new infrastructure, invest in the environment. We didn't talk about climate change tonight. Climate change didn't stop. We're talking about a hurricane season coming forward. We saw what Hurricane Sandy did to our communities. We need to do better. So it's about solarizing and green roofing and city building in Queens, having a deputy borough president for sustainability and resiliency, and then investing in our healthcare, making sure that we're building a new system, working with both public and private hospitals, so that the second wave of COVID does come, or another pandemic does come, that we're prepared and that we're not behind. And then it's using the power that the fighter, being your voice, your county executive, whether it's making sure to get us a voice on the MTA, having an MTA board member, whether it's making sure we fight for better schools and better funding. That's why I'm proud to be supported by Jessica Ramos and State Senator Michael Gianaris. We've been fighting those fights in Albany. We need to make sure we're really fighting for having outreach and diversity to every community, everyone in the borough. 190 plus languages that are spoken here in Queens. It's not only about diversifying our community boards and making them more reflective, but making sure government works for each and every resident in the borough of Queens. That's the borough that's the future that we need to build. So again, you can go to votecosta.com for more information. And I look forward to finishing this race strong, and I hope to have earned the support of the people of Queens. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the candidates for joining us tonight. I know an hour of anyone's time in these days is a difficult thing to get, and it's very much appreciated. I also want to thank everyone tuning in, all the voters. Same goes for you. An hour of your time is a precious thing, and we really appreciate it. Just as a reminder, the Democratic primary for Queensborough President is on June 23rd, although you can request an absentee ballot. That deadline is fast approaching. So you should go to either qns.com to find our primer on the Democratic primary, or head to vote.nyc for more information on voting. Lastly, a lot of you submitted questions tonight. We'll be reaching out to the candidates and getting answers on as many of the questions that we can. And we'll be posting that to qns.com later in the week, next week rather. And that's it. I'm Jacob Kaye, Angélica Acevedo, and Karmina Fonseca were our other moderators tonight. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.